Hello, everyone. Welcome to an overview of public health emergency preparedness and response. My name is Dr. Mike Prelep. I'm a professor in the Department of Community Health Sciences at the UCLA Fielding School of Public Health. As we learned, disasters can happen at any time and any place. Disasters can strike quickly and without warning. You and others in your community may have to evacuate or shelter in place. It is critical that you are prepared before disaster strikes and that you are prepared everywhere. This can be your home, work, school, or in your community. In recent years, the magnitude and frequency of disasters has increased. Because of this, there's a critical need to build the capacity of the current and future workforce to adequately respond to public health emergencies. To address this need, we must first expand community knowledge related to the science of public health emergency preparedness and response, also known as PHEPR. This knowledge will help us plan, operationalize, and evaluate our ability to prepare for, respond to, and recover from public health emergencies. To rapidly disseminate this knowledge, our team of experts in the field of public health have spent time upcycling existing training content. By leveraging existing material, we have been able to quickly assemble a wide range of online courses that can be used and applied across a variety of emergency contexts. As you watch the following course, we encourage you to think through how you might utilize the presented information in your workplace, home, and in your community. By the end of this course, you will be able to, 1, understand the responsibilities of health departments in public health emergencies. 2, describe the role of the public health department in relation to other responding agencies. And 3, understand the roles and responsibilities of the functional units of the incident command system. Whether you are new to PHEPR or have extensive experience already, we hope that you are further prepared to take an active role in disaster response and recovery within your community. Thank you so much for joining us.
So what I really want to talk about today is for you to understand, come out of the COVID mindset a little bit. I mean, use that experience definitely, but let's pull back and realize the rest of the world keeps moving with everything else that we have on our plate, especially other disasters, right? And just as you're moving into your role in a public health department, you're going to be tasked with responding to other disasters. And so I want us to understand kind of those responsibilities, the larger framework, and then something called the incident command system, which is how we respond. It's sort of that model tool that we use in response. But I will tell you, incident command is a wonderful tool to use in your life, right? When you start thinking about just how to approach things, this idea of kind of stepping back for a minute and just taking everything in. And I think it's important to realize that everything is like that. In disasters, one of the things people make the biggest mistake in is this idea that it's a disaster, we respond. No, we don't. You need to take a breath. You need to step back. In many health plans that we've written, when we look at public health departments, the first step is breathe. And that's important, right? Because haste makes waste. You really need to understand what's happening and how to address that situation. So important to sort of think about that as we move forward. So we're going to talk a little bit about just disasters in general, natural disasters and human-induced disasters, and what that means in the larger scope of disaster response. So let's go to the next slide. What is a hazard? So this is really important, right? A hazard is something that's naturally occurring, right? Or is a human-induced condition or a phenomenon that can present a risk to life, property, a danger to sort of society. So we have acute onset, right? Tornadoes, earthquakes, wildfires, hazardous materials. Chronic onset, we've seen this a lot, right? Happening now, especially with drought and what that looks like and sort of all of the things that we have to deal with, and severe air pollution. So next slide. So these hazards exist, fires exist all the time, but are they disasters? And so that's a really key point to kind of think about. Disasters are relational. Basically, a hazard becomes a disaster when someone or an agency or a jurisdiction can't deal with it. So when it's outside of their efforts to be able to cope with it, that's when it actually becomes a disaster. And that's an important thing to kind of keep in mind when you talk to different agencies and then when you work in different places, right? So I work, and those of you who will spend any time with me in these 2 years know, I work in a region between Armenia and Azerbaijan called Nagorno-Karabakh. 150,000 people, politically unstable, just had war last year, a lot of things happening. And I wrote their first national health plan, but they are a country that's not recognized. So, but it's a small place with very, very minimal resources. So a 5-car collision on their main highway is a disaster for their response capabilities. They don't have that many ventilators. They don't have that kind of emergency management to be able to respond. A 5-car collision on the 5 is not a good thing, but it's definitely not a disaster, right? It doesn't overwhelm our system. And so that's important to keep in mind when you move into these local health jurisdictions, right? So an event, a hazardous event happening in one place may be a disaster and not in another. The other important thing to think about, let's go to the next slide, is the idea that something becomes a disaster, again, when you don't have the resources to deal with it. So in order for you to know that, you need to know what your resources are. You need to know what your vulnerabilities are. You need to understand really well where that tipping point is. It's also super important in our governmental structure to understand where that tipping point is, because it's only then when you proclaim an emergency, right? We hear that all the time. So the mayor proclaimed an emergency. The governor proclaimed an emergency. And sometimes you're like, of course, it's an emergency. What do you mean you have to go and proclaim it, right? But that proclamation is important because that basically sets in motion this idea that, hey, I can't deal with it anymore. I need mutual aid. So the city basically says, the mayor says, I can't, it's an emergency for me. County, I need you to step in. Then the county does it, et cetera. And it moves up that chain. Disasters are always local. This is another important thing to think about, right? We command and respond and prepare for disasters locally. So if locally we can't deal with it, that's when mutual aid will step in. A county will not step into a city to provide assistance unless the city says, hey, I can't deal with it. Okay, so important to kind of keep that in mind. Next slide. So we'll go through a few of these hazards. So earthquakes. There's actually a picture from the Northridge earthquake, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. Next slide. Floods, next slide. Hurricanes, next slide. Tornadoes. By the way, chemical incidents, it's okay, go ahead, next slide. By the way, that one picture is Bhopal, India, one of the biggest chemical incidents that we had, killing thousands of people as they were asleep with the phosphorus gas moving over the actual community. And next slide, the one slot thing that added to our plate of hazards became bioterrorism, right? And interesting day that I'm actually doing this talk since tomorrow's 9/11. And really, 9/11 changed the game in disaster preparedness for the United States. So most of my work has been international. My disasters have been international, my degrees in international health systems management. And so after 9/11 is when I actually came to UCLA and became domestic. I always joke about that, but started really doing a lot of my work domestically. And the reason was that up until 9/11, we really didn't think about these threats, right? We didn't think about bioterrorism as a true threat, or terrorism actually as a true threat in the United States. And after 9/11, if you guys, study a lot of this, and you'll be thinking about it as you go into your local health jurisdictions, one of the first things that local health jurisdictions did was think about, oh my gosh, what are all of these other hazards that we had not thought about? And the first one that comes to mind is the picture on the right. Does anybody have any idea what that picture is? The one on the right? It looks like chickenpox, but it's not. Smallpox, woot woot. Wow. So I'm going to tell you something that you're going to put into that brain of yours. So when you go on Jeopardy, you win Jeopardy. All right. This is important. We think as humans that we are so smart, right? Everything that we do, all of this research, everything that we've been able to do, there is only one disease on this entire planet that we as humans have been able to eradicate from the face of the earth. Only one. Do we know what it is? Carlos, come back. Say the same thing again. It's smallpox. This is important, right? So smallpox is the only disease on the face of the planet that the human race has been able to eradicate. We've been trying to do polio, right? But there's still pockets of polio. At one point, we thought we were getting close to measles. Well, that was a whole thing that turned around, right? But smallpox, why it became really important is after 9/11, local health jurisdictions were like, smallpox. We need to have a smallpox plan, right? And people were like, smallpox plan? Like, there is no smallpox. But the reality is, basically, once it was eradicated, and so I am old enough that I actually have a smallpox vaccination scar. So once it was eradicated, they kept vials in two places. The CDC had vials, and the Soviet Union at that time, USSR, had vials kept just in case, so that we had, naturally occurring if something happened or whatever, but otherwise it was not happening, in community spread at all. Then when the Soviet Union broke apart, all of a sudden, some of those vials went missing. Dun, dun, dun. And there's like a whole source of like books and everything written on this, demon in the freezer, and just sort of all of these things, which is this concept of if those vials should get out, and then there's community spread, realizing it is like wildfire, smallpox, and none of us have any natural immunity to it. It's one of the best bioterrorism tools to use. So we started with, oh my God, should we put together a smallpox plan? And there was a whole thing of how do we create vaccines now? How do we start, who do we start immunizing? At that same time, right after 9/11, we started having all of the issues with the picture on the other side, which is anthrax, right? And there was this idea where anthrax was being sent out, or white powder was being sent in through the mail to different people. And so we are, the UCLA Center for Public Health and Disasters, got funding. So we were one of the national centers that got funding to start doing all of this preparedness planning, adding this as a hazard to local health jurisdictions. All right, next slide. So important to realize when we're talking about planning, what do we need to know? One of the things we need to really understand is vulnerabilities, right? So potential vulnerabilities, right? When we're thinking about any of the local health jurisdictions and planning, being an urban environment has its vulnerabilities, right? A lot of people would say, why? City's a great place. What do you mean about vulnerabilities? But can you think of some things in urban places that may be vulnerabilities? I mean, put it into the chat if you can, right? Versus a lot of times when we're talking, we say rural. Rural is a vulnerability, right? But rural is a vulnerability, but it also has its resources. So there's always a balance. When we think about earthquakes, one of the worst places to be is in a city with high rises that didn't have, right, any of their codes, building codes. Concrete is actually sand, basically. And so thinking about that is a vulnerability. But so many times when we do program planning, we always give urban as if it's actually always a plus, and it isn't, right? And this is important. In disaster planning, which by the way becomes development planning, you should really think about vulnerabilities for what's in front of you, right? So that's a really important thing. So for each hazard, there will be different vulnerabilities, okay? Building types, again, huge difference, right? And we look at California has one of the best codes in building construction because of earthquakes, because of us learning, right? We know though, in the East Coast, there still could be earthquakes. It's way more rare. They have all those brick buildings, not a great place to be should that happen, right? So thinking about some of that. Infrastructure, this is huge. One of the biggest issues with vulnerabilities of infrastructure in places that have a lot of infrastructure is that we're so dependent on it, right? How many of you have like all of a sudden you lose electricity for an hour and you're like freaking out, right? How am I going to do this? How am I going to do this? But like in so many places around the world, they only have electricity for 1 hour a day. And they've learned how to be able to run their systems efficiently and effectively and thinking about that. So thinking about all of those things is important. Economics, we obviously know. Looking at SES and what happens, disasters do not hit equally. COVID, right? We knew this. We've known this in public health for everything. But how it's been exacerbated by understanding where those differences are and where the issues are. And then demographics. And demographics is not only looking at, vulnerability in the sense of zip codes and all that, but it's also age, right? So for example, in earthquakes, the elderly are a really critical demographic that needs additional assistance. Heat waves. When we see heat waves, right, coming across, we always hear that there are the elderly that are homebound that then succumb to heat waves, right? And there's mortality because of that. Understanding that is important. Some infectious diseases, 0 to 5s, right? Those are the ones that we're really thinking about as we do all of this planning. So every single need in front of you, you need to identify what the vulnerabilities are. Next slide. Flip side is the resources, right? We need to understand what we have. By the way, the community has amazing resources, right? And one of the things, and I'll just take COVID as an example, we didn't, because we didn't know, and we really were behind the 8 ball in so many ways, but we did not activate our communities the way we should have, then the way we could have early on to really make a difference in messaging, in moving things forward, right? And getting people involved in what we, not to mention, we knew a lot of things that we already had previously that we could have worked a lot better on, right? Just in, medical mistrust and all of those other issues, mistrust with government, mistrust, all of those things, which we know, by the way, and they only get exacerbated as we're in this disaster situation. But we also need to know our resources, and our best resources are our people, right? And understanding who we have and what we could do. But again, what are our resources for transportation? What kind of infrastructure do we have? Well, do we have one road in, one road out? What does that look like, right? So again, coming back to Nagorno-Karabakh, there's one highway that connects it to its neighboring country where all of its supplies come in. And of course, during this war, what did they do? They bombed that one highway, right? So understanding how you move is really important. Public health infrastructure. Every county has a different infrastructure. Every county has different resources, right? Understanding that. And then globally, but I don't want it to just be here. I want you to always think like act local, but think global, right? Understanding, and we saw it with COVID, each country had a whole different way of responding, again, because of its public health infrastructure and its resources that were available and what they did. And then the disaster response system. I mean, we have an incredible disaster response system in the US, especially a medical one, right? So looking at both search and rescue, but disaster medical teams. We have disaster veterinary teams. We have disaster morticians that come out, right? But guess what we didn't have? We didn't have a disaster public health response team, right? And what did that look like early on? And so thinking about that moving forward and what that looks like is super important. Next slide. So unfortunately, being as anthropocentric as we are, we don't consider anything a disaster until it actually hits communities, right? So forests can be burning and we're like, it's bad, but as soon as a house burns down, we're like, oh my gosh, more resources. And of course, understanding that, but it's important, right? The biggest problem with this, and I want you to always think about this, is numbers don't always define the magnitude of a disaster, right? So for example, when we think about Haiti, the Haiti earthquake, which I responded to, had about 200,000 deaths. That's horrible, right? 200,000. And I always say to everybody, stop for a second, because just one person, one death is this entire family falling apart and what that looks like, right? But 200,000. But you know what the worst part about it? They're still dealing with all of the effects of the disaster. So 200,000 is mortality, but it's been, 12 years now, I think it is, 2010, that there's no infrastructure. All of those things haven't come back online. So the disaster was huge. It's not just mortality and morbidity, but it's sort of the infrastructure and how it affects development for generations within that country and what that looks like moving forward. So always keeping that in mind is important. Next slide. So why do we always study disasters? Some hazards have more to impact. My backyard is actually like a canyon. And every year we have fires in the canyon. 3 times I've had to evacuate. Watching my house where they've actually come and had like the TV crews in my backyard, and just thinking, you know, here goes my house, etc. But guess what? I come back to my house every year, right? Or landslides, people, they rebuild their house, and sort of thinking about that. Not to mention, obviously, population growth, urbanization, but also when we're talking about urbanization, we also have to worry a lot, especially globally, about sprawl, right? Urbanization that sort of takes its own movement in the way buildings are planned, et cetera. Obviously, much more increase in manufacturing, distribution of materials. I mean, just drive on the 5 and those trucks moving back and forth and what that looks like, right, in movement. Reemergence of old style threats, TB. That's one of them, right? We thought we were TB, and then look where we are and sort of thinking about these things. And then emergence of new threats, which we're living in. It's so interesting, by the way, as I started going through this talk, which I've given a similar talk since 9/11, right? You know, and sort of getting, I was just, you know, this idea of emergence of new threats was something that we always talked about. And we talked a little bit, you know, we had SARS that happened. We had H1N1 that happened. We had avian influenza that we were talking about. We knew this was coming, but now looking back, I'm like, geez, what did we just go through? Like all of these things that we had talked about, but how it unfolded is just incredible, right? Next slide. So what happens with disasters? We know that we have, you know, increased illness, injury, death, destruction of healthcare infrastructure in most of these things, especially if it's something that's actually a natural disaster like earthquakes, wildfires, tornadoes, all of those things. Displacement of populations, we see that a lot, right? Psychological stressor, really thinking about just the mental health, well-being of our populations. Trauma, what does that look like? How do we actually address it in mass casualty events? And then potential for changes in the environment, which we've seen. So let's go through a few of those slides. Next slide. So impacts of disasters, we know there's direct impacts, right? Injuries, illness, death, everything that we've been seeing. Healthcare infrastructure, so a lot of places, this is in a medical records room in Armenia, Colombia. People make fun of me because all my work is in Armenia, and they're like, even in Colombia, you were in the city of Armenia when this earthquake happened, right? And so the idea is, there was 2 health centers, one already collapsed after the earthquake. This is the second one. This is their medical records room. Now, you know, everything is a lot more digitized, but back then wasn't and still isn't for most places. This is the entire record keeping of that area. We were there, no roof, raining on top of this, and about 2 hours later, this healthcare facility also slid down the hill, right? So really thinking about how we're impacted is much more than just, you know, individuals, right? Communication, infrastructure, labs. Just look at COVID for a second and the direct impact of surge, right? Now, what we're hearing is there may be testing deficiency, like not having enough tests again in our state and maybe even nationally. So thinking about all of these things that disasters cause are super important. Next slide. Okay, this is an injury pyramid of the Northridge earthquake. 94 earthquake happened. This is one of the research that we did following it, 2 weeks following the Northridge earthquake, really looking at what were the sort of impacts of the earthquake itself. So the Northridge earthquake was about a 6.7 on the Richter scale. And we say that we have anywhere between, if you look at the different records, we have anywhere between 30 and about 60 deaths directly related to the earthquake. And what I mean by that is we had, for example, 16 deaths directly in that one apartment building that collapsed. Okay, so that's attributed directly to the earthquake. However, we had a bunch of heart attacks, right? That were then either they died in their home or came to the hospital and died in the hospital. And so then there's this thing of, was that a heart attack that was going to happen? Was that a heart attack that you're attributing to the earthquake, right? So it becomes a little messy in just looking at just the demographics of that. But pretty much if you look at it, 30 to 50 people perished in that earthquake. The most important part of this is that bottom part of the pyramid. By the way, this is true. This pyramid, this concept of the pyramid is something you'll see in public health all the time, right? We always see the tip of the glacier. right? Especially when we talk about disease and, we talk about death, but really it's that bottom that matters. This is also true when we talk about programming. We always say, flip it, right? Provide most of your work should be for that lowest rung when you're thinking about what kind of programming to put into place. So if you look at this, you could see there's 16,000 people were out of hospital treatment release, and 221,000 people reported 2 weeks after the earthquake that they were injured and received no treatment, right? All of those could conceivably turn into something else, secondary infections, et cetera, et cetera. So you see that if we just said, oh, the earthquake caused 30 deaths, for example, people would be like, oh, okay, that's not bad, and they move on, right? Especially now when we're so desensitized to numbers. But the reality is it created huge issues. We had 2 hospitals go down in the region, et cetera, et cetera. So important to kind of think about that larger perspective. Same Richter, 1988 in Armenia, the earthquake happened, and we have close to 50,000 deaths. 50,000 deaths, same Richter, and mostly buildings killed people in Armenia. So the other thing is, let's just take Haiti, for example. Haiti was a 7.0, again, 200,000 people, but till today, they are really dealing with the aftermath of everything that was destroyed during that, right? Infrastructure, housing, educational systems, et cetera, et cetera. Next slide. So there's also a lot of indirect effects, which is important to keep in mind. Population displacement, we see this a lot in natural disasters, right? Where we can displace populations, right? So after an earthquake, we set up a shelter. After a tornado, we set up a shelter. We also see it a lot in migration of refugee movements or internally displaced populations and what that looks like. The lost medication, I always write this there because so many times we have SNFs, right? Those skilled nursing facilities that need to be moved. And if they're not good with sort of their emergency management and how they move it, all of a sudden 8 o'clock comes by and everybody needs to have that medication, their secondary doses, what does it look like, et cetera, and making sure that that continuum of care doesn't break at any point in time. Obviously, a lot of secondary illnesses, especially with wound care, but also looking at stress and sort of all of those things that we talk about. And then indirect impacts. So healthcare personnel, let me go back to direct impacts. Originally, what we did when all of this happened was they asked us in the state of California, can you do surge planning? Like basically, can you count how many doctors you have and how many nurses you have? And it was so hard to do because we started realizing that one physician, right, could be registered in 4 different hospitals. So we were counting them 4 times versus it's one person divided among those 4 places, right? And we always forget that first responders are people too, right? And so they could be the people that are either directly impacted, mortality, morbidity, and all of that, and or access problems. If you have one road leading into that area and you're in a different county and you can't get in, that's a big issue, right? There's a picture from the earthquake. One of the deaths that we had in the Northridge earthquake was on the 14 freeway where a police officer, the bridge fell, and actually a police officer went over the edge of it when it happened, right? The other thing is indirect impacts, increased utilization, right? All of a sudden, you are impacted with everybody coming for care, everybody needing more than what you were providing ahead of time. And then utilities, right? Really thinking about electricity, water, what does it mean? If your hospital goes down, which it did in the Northridge earthquake, the Northridge Hospital here, the Granada Hills Hospital went down, they moved everything outside, but they needed waters, generator, et cetera, to be able to provide that kind of assistance moving forward. Next slide. So again, displacement of populations is a huge, huge issue. So a lot of my work internationally has been in refugee or IDP, internally displaced movements, and working in those settlements or camps, depending on what it is that we were doing. So really thinking about resetting all of these basic sort of life necessities, water, sanitation, et cetera, and all of these people, not to mention the psychological stressors. That picture on the right is actually following the Indonesian tsunami, where people were trying to reunite families. And so we had areas, and the American Red Cross spent a lot of its time in basically reunification, trying to help people find one another. Next slide. And then potential changes in the environment. There's actually a picture of Exxon Valdez, again, 80s, but really huge oil tanker. And so what does that look like when we start thinking about additional issues in disasters? Next slide. So as I said, the impact of disasters basically makes you need more services exactly at the point where you can only provide less services. And this is a key, right? COVID hit. We, as a public health infrastructure, we were not well funded. We were always underfunded, right? We've always been, because everything worked so well, you know, people say, oh, Dr. Dorian, now with the pandemic, people understand what public health does. And I want to say, hey, you know what? The 100 years where there was no pandemic, that was public health strength, right? And really creating these systems to help you to be robust. But right now, when people start forgetting all of that and less funding came in, then when we needed it, we were really at a disadvantage. And this is the truth for all disasters, right? At the point that you need to provide more services is usually when you're most incapacitated. Next slide. So what are the things that we want to think about? Next slide. The major functions in public health during disasters. So we have fundamental obligations within our local health department, right? Preventing epidemic and spread of disease, protecting against environmental hazards, injury, promoting healthy behavior, mental health, and it's a fundamental obligation to respond to disasters and assist communities in recovery. So right now, again, after COVID, you would look at this and go, wow, it makes sense. But when we first started doing all of these trainings for local health departments, they were like, really? Responding to disasters is a fundamental obligation of public health? Because most of the disasters like fire or tornadoes, the fire was in charge, right? Or police were in charge, or emergency operations of the city were in charge. Public health was really never the commanding agency in any of these things. So they were always kind of just helping out. But we came back to this thing of like, absolutely. And in any bio event, whether bioterrorism, epidemic, etc., you're actually the lead agency. And so we spent a lot of time in helping them actually create these plans, which I'll talk about a little bit, and exercise these plans, because public health has a hard time in being a commander. Like, it's not really our personality in many ways, but we need to be able to, in any of those situations, take command. And right now, even though there is unified command, which we'll talk about, really health is in charge of what are the activities that need to happen, right, for COVID. Next slide. So the local health officer. So every local health jurisdiction has a local health officer. In the state of California, which is not true everywhere else, but in the state of California, the local health officer must be an MD, actually. They don't have to have any public health background, but they definitely have to be an MD. And the local health officer, as I said, all disasters are local. They are the ones in charge of the health of their population. They are the ones that can actually declare an emergency for anything like, epidemic, plant, animal infestation, air pollution, whatever it is that will affect the health of their population. They actually will become commander and have that right to declare that emergency. They also, by the way, local health officers have the authority to order an evacuation. So just kind of thinking about that. How do they exercise it? It's changed a lot, right? Especially with COVID, they've learned a lot more how to sort of exercise their authority, but they also understand if they're going to order an evacuation, that's nothing that they're doing. They're just saying it. All of the other agencies are the ones that are really coordinating that. So really understanding what that looks like and moving forward. Next slide. So this slide, or any slide actually, when I talk about disasters, kind of freaks me out because it almost looks like if you prepare, disaster will come, like if you look at it. But the reality is these are kind of the phases of disasters, right? So we really think about preparedness. You got to get your ducks in a row ahead of time. Hello, that's life, right? And again, if you look at COVID, we weren't there, right? Because in some ways, it's one of those things about insurance, right? You don't, and we're going to talk about this later on, of how prepared are you actually if something happens, right? This concept of maybe it won't happen yet, right? Let's talk about earthquakes. For sure, there will be a big earthquake, maybe up to an 8.0, for sure. So it's not if, it's when. But how many of us are thinking about that right now, right? And and we're overdue. It's past the time. So it's going to come, right? And so being prepared is really important. The other piece that's important about this is that idea of response. So first of all, these are all artificial like words, and people have artificial definitions of, okay, when does response become recovery, right? And it depends on who you ask, right? So there may be people right now that say, we're in recovery. Like we went through the hardest times of COVID, like get us together, we're recovering. And there may be people that are, oh, we're just in response with Delta increasing, things happening, right? So it's just kind of understanding that, but it's important in the type of resources that get given by the government based on sort of where we are in this cycle. Next slide. So when we're planning for disasters, and I think important to keep this in mind, let me backtrack for a minute. I am a program planner, period. I happen to do most of my program planning during disasters. And why do I say that? It's important to realize that the science of public health does not get lost just because it's a disaster, right? Just because you got to move faster and understand things a little quicker doesn't mean we are devoid of the science and the art of public health. And that's important, right? And probably the most important thing, takeaway from this in your careers moving forward, I would say are sort of two things. One, if you don't really understand the problem, you can't find a solution. And what we do in general in program planning is, here's a needs assessment and we move on. We don't really drill down to understand the problem in every kind of programming we do, right? When we're thinking about like vaccine hesitancy or whatever that term is, right? We should have understood it so we can address. Now we're just like, okay, let's bring this person and they are an influencer and let's say that, right? But we're just throwing things at a wall and hoping it sticks because we don't really understand the problem. And this is important. So even during a disaster where you don't have a lot of time, you need to understand that community. You need to understand where the problems are and how we're going to do this, okay? The other thing to really understand, again, coming back, is the community is your best asset. I tell my students all the time, by the way, you're just a tool. You're a tool. You happen to know public health better, but the community is the expert, right? So always going in with that mindset of, hey, I have these tools. How can I help you figure out what needs to happen? It's too late at a disaster, right? Preparedness. But I am that person who believes that the disaster is just a moment in time for me to, yes, respond and do everything, but it's that moment in time to put into play the best foundational development programming that I can put. It's not a Band-Aid. All of the stuff that we've been doing should not be Band-Aids. We should be building the infrastructure of public health right now during COVID, right? And so think about that. Every time you put something into play, is it truly sustainable? And don't think of the word sustainable like, like, is it real? Am I really bettering things? Did I use this horrible event that happened? Like, did I use the silver lining of that to create the next step that's better? Right? And so thinking about that is important. So when we start thinking about planning in communities, and we'll talk a little bit, you guys will talk too, the first thing you need to know is what hazards are there, right? So I'm not going to plan for a tornado if the tornado is not here, right? So thinking about that. So it's important to understand what hazards there are and the likelihood of those hazards. It's also important to know what they will impact, right? So in LA County, bioterrorism is it's likely, right? It's not as likely as wildfire, but if it's going to happen, it'll probably happen in LA, one of the places that we know we should be ready for. But what will it impact? Wildfires will impact a lot, but if a BT event like smallpox happens in LA, the impact is huge. So it's this give and take of where do I put my resources and how do I think about it, right? At the same time, we need to identify our vulnerabilities, not this general vulnerabilities in the world. Me, my county. What's my problem? What are my issues? Like, you got to look at it straight in the eye, right? But also, what are my resources? And think creatively. A lot of times we come back and CBOs, NGOs, all of those are like, after all these things, this last list, oh yeah, why don't we reach out to those community-based organizations that work with the community? Why aren't they part of planning? Why aren't they on the planning committee to begin with, right? So thinking about that. And then we develop mitigation, preparedness, response plans. plans are not pieces of paper. This is a huge, huge problem, right? It's not, I wrote this paper and now go and do it. It's, let's go and exercise it. And we've done so many exercises, right? And does this work? How do I do it? What worked? What didn't work? And how do we switch it? People always say, like all of us in disasters, I've been to so many earthquakes, they never look the same. They never look the same. There's a lot of commonalities, so that's important. I don't have to plan a different plan in every earthquake I go to, huge commonalities, but at the same time, there's nuances. How it hit, who the audience is, who's hit most, how do I prepare, what kind of resources do they have, what kind of vulnerabilities, et cetera, et cetera. And then I bolded the last statement, which is evaluate. Monitor, evaluate, monitor, evaluate, even during a disaster, which is where we always mess up. Well, we don't have time. Well, if you don't have time, you don't know if what you're doing actually works, right? It's not a feel good. It's not, yay, I passed out these blankets, feel good. It's what really happened. Did you actually reach those objectives that you had in mind? And this is important. So you have to take the time to evaluate and monitor and be humble enough to come back and say, this didn't work, we need to switch and do this, right? And I think that's an important piece to keep in mind. Next slide. So as we're planning, again, we talked about some of those, thinking of a grid, because the reality is we have a budget. And so we need to figure out where do we put, right? Sort of how do we spread that out? How do we think about those things that are low probability, like terrorism, but high consequence, versus things that are high probability and low consequences, right? And so thinking about that and what's in between. And then how do we actually prioritize and create our plans moving forward? Next slide. So what do we do, right, when we think about disasters? We basically assess the health impacts in the community. Don't only think COVID. Your experience right now, and by the way, now you are experts in, right, COVID and response for an pandemic. Like, who could have said that, right? You and I became experts at the same time on pandemics, which is kind of amazing, right? But really looking at, in general, what do we do following any kind of disaster? We really look at the health impacts in the community, right? Environmental health has to assess water, sanitation, air, where are we? Acute communicable disease tracks infectious diseases, injury program tracks injuries, the labs, health officer coordinates kind of the response, as well as messaging that goes out. And there's a lot of collaboration among other agencies. Next. The key to all of this is this concept of all hazards planning. So all of your local health jurisdictions should have an all hazards plan, and they should be updating it, and they should regularly be thinking about the response, and what they've learned from COVID should actually be feeding into this all hazards response plan now, right? And the concept here is you don't want specific plans. You don't need a plan off the shelf that's for smallpox, a plan off the shelf for anthrax, a plan off the shelf that's for earthquakes. So much of what we're going to do is the same in our response capacity, right? And then you might have appendices that say, hey, you know what? With a communicable disease, you don't want to bring everybody into a point of mass dispensing, right? But for this kind of disease, you can utilize this and that. So it's important to develop these all hazards plans and, and think about how to update them regularly. Next slide. So again, important to realize that so many people are part of response. It's not just public health, right? And so understanding how to coordinate all of that is the biggest thing that we need to do. Next slide. So if you look at just sort of response on a federal level, all these agencies are responsible for responding just on the federal level. So remember, we start with what do we need to do in a city? What do we need to do in a county? For us with local health jurisdictions, it's pretty much counties, right? What do we do in a region? What do we do in the state? What do we do on the regions of the nation? And then what do we do nationally? Like all those people respond to these emergencies when we're talking about it. So how do we coordinate all of that? Next slide. And we do it through something called NIMS, the National Incident Management System. Next slide. So the reality is, and so something else for us to be proud of, that in the 1970s, there was crazy wildfires in California, and they lost, a lot of acres, I think 700 homes were destroyed, 16 people died, but there was a home of a congressperson, of course, which always sort of leads us to start looking at things a little more deeply. But that was the biggest issue that they had there, was the lack of coordination. So they started looking at their system of response, and they realized everybody was on a different wavelength on their radios. When they came to put the hoses into the hydrants, the couplings weren't being able to be utilized. It wasn't universal. So much mismanagement with a lot of resources, but it was because they didn't all talk to each other. So early on, California came up with something called FireScope in the 80s, basically. And then that started developing into much stronger incident command sort of system and response. And then in the early 2000s, the United States nationally took sort of that idea and created this national incident management system. So we started it in California. So NIMS is really about finding a system that's proactive in really bringing all of these levels of government, non-governmental organizations, private, public, all of them together to have the same terminology, to have the same understanding of how to respond, so that we are more effective and efficient, but really, especially in reducing redundancies. We see that in disasters all the time. Groups of people doing the same thing. So there's a bunch of stuff being done in one sector, which doesn't need to happen. And then there's all these huge gaps in response that aren't actually happening. So the idea of NIMS is really to be able to create an efficient system, to understand where everyone is working, but we all use the same terms and the same structure as we respond. The other thing that's important is they put this into play, and then they're like, hey, everyone, when you ask for mutual aid, when you declare a disaster and you say, I need help, in order for you to get help, in order for you to get reimbursed, you must use this system. So it's also tied back into funding for all of the local health jurisdictions, that they must use NIMS and SEMS, which we'll talk about in a second. Next slide. So NIMS is really built around these 14 management characteristics, which, by the way, I know you guys, I think, have access to these slides, hopefully, but I always think of these as something that you want to manage yourself, right? Or your organization, or the team that you have, right? Really thinking about some of these things. Common terminology, which we'll talk about. No codes, right? I'm not going to say something and you're not going to understand it. What does it mean? Modular organization. So you can get bigger and smaller as needed. And that's really important in response. Management by objectives. What the heck are we supposed to do? And how do we measure that we did it right? Yeah. And on and on. And so we'll talk about some of these pieces. You'll see how they do it in local health jurisdictions. But important to realize that they kind of took these important management principles and created it as part of the system. Next slide. So NIMS and then SEMS, which we'll talk about, which is the exact same thing, but in California, is really built around these three ideas. Incident command system. You're going to hear this all the time, okay? And it's basically how to put people into a response org chart so that everybody knows exactly what their job is and what they need to do. It's around this idea of having a coordination system for multi-agency, multi-jurisdiction, et cetera. So for example, they create groups like the EOC, Emergency Operations Center, which we'll talk about now, where groups of people come there in order to do the response. And then the third piece, which, by the way, for all of us have realized in COVID is probably the most important piece in all of this, is public information, right? Communication. We know, especially in a disaster, communication is key. Risk-com. If we don't put out real, true, understandable information, how do you expect people to be able to do what they need to do? By the way, this is the key to disasters, to take care of themselves. The idea of any disaster response is to empower the individual and the community to take care of themselves, to be able to make the right decisions for themselves and their community. Next slide. So again, it's just this idea of communication across levels. As I talked about, we go all the way from the field to the local, operational, et cetera. The EOC is basically a place. So what we do is we activate the Emergency Operations Center, which is usually like a physical place. I mean, it's been virtual now for many people, but it's a place where all responding agencies send a rep to, So they're there together all the time, and they coordinate all of the actions there, right? And so important to kind of keep that in mind. So in the county, there's a county emergency operations center, and anybody who is responding from public health, from Parks and Rec, whatever it is, they send their reps there. And by the way, in there, they will have their own ICS structure, which we'll talk about again, so that they know who's doing the operations, the planning, et cetera. But everybody comes together in order to make the decisions in one place. Before, it would just be like, hey, public health, what are you doing? Hey, this is actually an EOC gets activated, is the word. Once the city or the county activates their EOC, they send their reps there, and then they start doing sort of incident command and incident planning from that place. Next slide. Once an EOC is activated, then every agency, so think public health for a second, they activate what they call a DOC, a Department Operations Center. And you'll hear this a lot. EOC and DOC is sort of how they talk about it. The DOC is public health's EOC, basically, inside for themselves. So once that EOC is activated, somebody from public health goes there so that they can make the decisions. And it's not always one person, but there's always an agency representative, right? But public health needs to activate its own EOC, which is its own DOC, so that they can decide how to do whatever they're going to do. In any of these sort of biological disasters, the health officer, which would be the incident commander for our own Department Operations Center, usually gets sent to the EOC, and then there's still somebody there that becomes their second in charge, becomes the incident commander at the DOC. Okay, next slide. And then public information, right? Again, it's usually led by a PIO. By the way, every department has their own internal PIOs, and we'll talk about that, public information officers. But in the EOC, there's a whole area, and sometimes they even activate something called a JIC, Joint Information Center, which is on the EOC level, where they bring all of the PIOs together so that they can craft good information for the public, right? So that the public knows how to respond to the incident that they're dealing with. Next slide. Okay, so that was NIMS. Now we have the same thing called SEMS in California. Right, next slide. Concept is the same, but remember, we actually created it. So kind of we moved the needle as we needed to do. But this is legally mandated, again, in the state of California. So everybody who wants to get any sort of reimbursement or being able to track their payroll, and there's a lot of cost, right, that needs to be tracked for response in going through this, and being able to receive any sort of reimbursement, they need to basically come into this SEMS unified structure. Again, same thing, it brings everybody together. Next slide. And really thinking about how to coordinate. What are the main things again? Flow of information, most important thing. So SEMS helps us figure out flow of information. It helps us coordinate among the agencies as we're moving, to mobilize resources, to know where it's going, and to minimize duplication. That's the whole point of response, right? But you could see that there's thought in each one of these steps in order to be able to do this. Next slide. Okay, so NIMS and SEMS being equal, just on different levels, they utilize something called ICS, Incident Command System. So Incident Command System, next slide, is not the same as NIMS and SEMS. Incident Command System is a tool inside of how to respond for NIMS and how to respond under SEMS, okay? It's a tool that basically allows us to really ensure that the information that we're processing flows efficiently and effectively. It's very much built on police and fire mentality, right? It's a command structure. Even though at one point, public health tried to call it incident coordination system, and that didn't go over very well with the other agencies, because they were like, when we come to a site, somebody's a commanding officer. And so we're like, all right, we get it. Okay. And so we kind of moved into that. So when we think about really how to manage, again, flow of information and coordinating all of these processes, we open up ICS. ICS is done at your DOC level, right? Your department operations level, so local health jurisdictions. But guess what? Hospitals use ICS, they call it HICS, hospital ICS. So every hospital actually has an ICS structure for them to respond. Schools use ICS, right? They use a response structure that they're supposed to open up after a disaster, again in ICS. So this is something that's like very common now and understood in sort of all of these places that provide assistance to large groups of people. Next slide. All right, benefits. Biggest benefits are this concept of common terminology, right? Everybody's speaking the same language. When I say ICS, everybody knows what that means. When I say incident commander, everybody knows what that is, right? And sort of moving it. When I say EOC, everyone uses EOC. Not public health uses a different word, you know, Parks and Rec uses a different word, the libraries. EOC is EOC. DOC is DOC, right? And so this is an important piece as we move forward and think about these things. Plain language. The other thing is position and structures, which we'll talk about. They don't shift. There's always command. There's always operations. There's always planning. There's always finance. There's always admin, right? And so logistics. So thinking about that. Resources. We understand sort of where they're stored and how we can access them together, right? Communication. There is one way of communicating, up and down through an ICS, and then how do we vertically communicate during agencies? We've learned this through the ICS structure. The other really amazing thing about ICS is its flexibility. You can open up as many sections as you want, depending on what's in front of you. So if it's a small disaster, you can just put a skeleton crew in there, right? But a larger disaster, you can expand. And then once you get to a point where you're like, we have a lot of this under control, you can contract. So it really allows that flexibility in disasters. And that's, by the way, another key take home, I think, in this. And again, I think it comes back to what Itzhak was saying, is this idea of it's important in a disaster to be flexible. So that means in order for you to be flexible, you have to be all of those amazing things of an amazing person, right? Like active listening, really, you know, making sure. So it's not this, I mean, yes, you command things that have to happen, but you really need to have that situational awareness and feel comfortable in the unknown, and just feel comfortable that there's no such thing as perfection, right? You need to make the best decision you can make based on the data you have. So you can only make good decisions if you have good data. Really thinking about that, right? The decisions you make really rests on the back of what kind of information you have. So thinking about that is important, right? Understanding your community, etc. Okay, next slide. So chain of command. This is really important in ICS. It's an orderly line of command and it's vertical. You only respond to one supervisor. That's important. You don't respond to, by the way, during the day, I am in acute communicable disease. My director is this. All that goes out the window. Your daily job goes out the window. Your day-to-day boss, your day-to-day supervisor out the window. In incident command, you just report directly to the box on top of you, that supervisor on top, right? And that's important because they want to ensure that the flow of information, you know, when I was a kid, we used to play tus telephone. That's how we say it in Armenian, I don't know. But really that idea, right? At the end, it's something totally different than what you've actually heard from the beginning. We don't want that. There's so many people playing, right? And so making sure that we understand that that's very important. You do not communicate horizontally, you communicate vertically. All right, next slide. What you can see is really hard for most of us in public health because we're so used to group decisions and, you know, sort of all of that playing across. And we do. I mean, there's definitely, obviously, all of that room in the planning and response. But the idea is you are told what to do by one. Sorry, we have noise outside. So you're told by one supervisor and you respond to one supervisor. And that's important. We see a lot of horizontal communication in liaison officers. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But each organization has liaison officers, obviously, if it's larger, that really deal with our partners. So the school district goes into its ICS, public health goes into its ICS, but then its liaison officers are the ones that actually work together in creating whatever response they need to do together. Next slide. All right, common terminology, right? Common terminology is that exact thing of just not using code, making sure that everybody understands. But again, It works because all of the terms are the same that every agency across the United States is using in response to these any sort of disaster. So I think that's really important. So they won't say, you know, this is unit 1, we have a 1037 code 2, like you're like, what the heck? No, it's none of that, right? So it's important to kind of, you know, common terminology so that everybody understands it. Next. Span of control. By the way, so you see how these management structures are really good things in you as a leader within your own team and sort of thinking about this as you're creating programming moving forward anyway. But also I think the span of control is very important. In NIMS and SEMS, we know that in organizational structures, that you can only give good supervision, good management of 3 to 7 people. They usually say it's a 1 to 5 ratio. So 1 supervisor to 5 staff, basically. And the idea is, yeah, you can have 300 people under you, right? But you cannot be a good manager and provide good supervision and you know, professional development and everything that they need to do to that many people. So really, span of control is this idea of 1 to 5, so 3 to 7 to 1. And that's what incident command really does. So every time there's too many people, it will open up. Remember that flexibility into another box and thinking about what that looks like. And it's a key in managing all of these incidents as we move forward. Next slide. ICS, dun, 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 the important piece for you guys to know. All of you, when you get into your local health jurisdiction at some point, should be slotted into one of these slots. You may know what it is, you may not know what it is. The day a disaster happens, that slot may not be where you're going to be slotted, by the way, because depending on who shows up, what the disaster is, et cetera, et cetera. But really, everybody goes into sort of these 5 structures. Let's go to the next slide. It's command. So command has a box, which is led by the incident commander, really responsible for that overall, right? Objectives, strategies, priorities, everything that we need to do within the response. Then there's the box for operations. Operations are the doers, right? They're the ones that will do all of the operations for our incident objectives. So the vaccine clinics would go there, the health communication, health education team would go there, et cetera, et cetera. They're the ones that do the operations. Then there's the planning team, and they're the ones that really support that incident action plan. They're the ones who will gather data, analyze data, forecast out. By the way, that's super important, right? So in something like a earthquake, you would forecast out, in the beginning, probably a few hours out just so you know where things are, but then you may forecast out every 12 hours. And what does that look like? Versus now, when we started, we were forecasting out what, 2 months, 3 months, and now we're continuously forecasting out, right, when we look at COVID. But that's really where that planning team really spends a lot of its time. The third group is the logistics group. And logistics is really, they're the ones that get all of the things for us, right? So really making sure that we have the equipment, the teams, the supplies, everything that we need to be able to do our work. And then finance and admin really track what's happening. They monitor the costs, they do contracting, they look at overtime, they look at volunteers, sort of all of that kind of record keeping and ensuring that we're in NIMS and SEMS so that we can get the reimbursement that we need moving forward after we respond. Okay, next slide. So we're going to spend the rest of our time really in this structure of incident command. So incident commander is really, as we talked about, really the person who has the overall coordination of, the activities, the response. They're the ones that integrate beyond. So they may actually be sent to the EOC, which we talked about. They're the ones that have that direct link to the state as we're looking through it. So really kind of understanding that the incident commander really looks at the planning, the objectives, the strategies, and makes the call. They have the final word in all of that. The other thing that they do a lot of is public information. And why I say that is, even though we have PIOs, and I know somebody put in the chat that they're interested, so we can talk offline about that. It's an amazing field to go into, overwhelming field, by the way, you can imagine, especially with something like COVID. But the reality is we've also come to understand people like to hear from, especially around these kinds of things, from doctors. I mean, okay, COVID has really flipped our world upside down in many ways of what's considered a trusted source, et cetera, et cetera. But usually in any of these kinds of medical, issues that we have, epidemics or outbreaks, people like to hear from the medical doctor. And usually as I said, our health officers are that. So a lot of times they're the ones frontline that are actually the spokesperson for a lot of these things, even though we have PIOs. So kind of keeping that in mind that they also have that role. Next slide. In a lot of disasters, there isn't just one commander, right? There's something called unified command. And that's because so many agencies have some pretty big roles to play. So usually, by the way, and you would see this in wildfires, if you guys remember, they'll be like, oh, we're going to have a press conference. Unified command is, it's usually fire and police, right? Or fire and the sheriff that come and they have that unified command and they talk to you. The idea is that both of those agencies are together in unified command as the incident commander. And together they manage what are sort of those decisions that need to be made as we're moving forward. This usually happens, again, in places with multiple jurisdictions or multiple jurisdictions and multiple agencies, especially larger things that need to be done. But also if there's things like evacuations and stuff, a lot of times we bring in them into incident command from the beginning to kind of think about those things. Next slide. Everything we do is done by objectives. So I know that most people will be like, really? Because objectives, when we do program planning, for anybody who's taken any classes in program planning, you know, you need to have objectives and they need to be smart, right? And smart means, right, simple, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time bound, right? You need to make sure that basically you are telling yourself and your team what you're going to do, when you're going to do it, what it's going to take to do it, what kind of an outcome you're looking for, right? And that's important because it comes back to measuring. Like, I don't know, did we do what we were supposed to do? Like, we know, for example, that, in this displaced population movement, they've arrived at the space. We need to build pit latrines, for example. Okay, how many pit latrines? How many people are there? How fast are we going to be able to do it? We're going to start with family ones, then we're going to move to individual ones, whatever it is. But I need to be able to measure and come back and say, all right, I said by next Friday, I was going to have 25 of them. And this is an easy one because what I'm giving you is outputs versus change in knowledge or change in whatever, right? But again, it's important to realize even during disasters, if you don't have management by objectives, you don't know if what you're doing is appropriate, right? And that's important, which is also comes back to what I said about that humility, coming back and going, this isn't working. This isn't right. We need to shift, right? So it's important that from the beginning, we start creating these objectives, and we can only create them on the back of data. What's the true need? How do we do things? How do we move forward? Next slide. Okay, so this is, again, the structure of incident command. We'll go through it a little bit, but you could see there's the incident commander and the command staff, which is the PIO, safety officer, liaison officer, and then our general staff that we looked at, right? Operations, planning, logistics, and section chief. When you look at the operations section chief, a lot of times they're part of that command staff, right? Because that would be the group that would meet together. The incident commander will work directly with each one of those boxes. So that's 4 people and usually 1 person in each of those. So that's 7, right? So you see that span of control, the way they kind of think about it as they're working, so that they're not, incident commander isn't talking to everybody that's responding, only those people that are providing the information to them to be able to move forward. Next slide. So command staff really is the people that look at the operation for the department, right? And so what I mean by that is, next slide. As we said, the incident commander manages and executes the incident action plan. Next slide. Safety officer. So the safety officer is the person who's in charge for the health and safety of the agency personnel. Are they getting the food they need? Are they getting the rest they need? Are they on a 12 on, 12 off? What does that look like? When they're going out, do they have the PPE that they need, right? It's really taking care of our internal departmental operations, right? So the people that are responding, what does that look like and how does it make sense? So that's what the safety officer does. It advises the IC on those safety matters and decisions that need to be made. Next slide. The public information officer is for the department, right? Really thinking about what is the information that needs to be sent. One thing to realize is, remember I told you there's that joint information center. One of the lead PIOs from here may join that as well. So maybe the incident commander goes to the EOC, maybe our lead PIO goes to the joint information center there, but then there's a lead PIO here that really thinks about how to interact with the media, how to create risk communication messaging, how to ensure that the messaging is appropriate. Again, coming back to control and command, nobody else from the agency is supposed to talk to media. Only the PIO and their team. And that's really to ensure that there's one message going out, right? Really understanding that the words matter, how are we saying things? So it's important to realize that even though, and you notice this now, you'll start noticing like, we don't hear from just anybody doing work. We're not hearing from the director of blah, blah in these operations usually, right? Usually it comes back to the departmental PIO and or if there's, whoever they've assigned to do that. But it's very controlled in that sense, mostly to ensure that appropriate messaging gets out. What's our biggest problem? Misinformation and disinformation, right? And especially that we've seen with disasters. So really thinking about that is important. And the command staff has a lead PIO. Next slide. Liaison officer. So the liaison officer is really the one, remember we talked about when we looked at schools and public health, they're that vertical. So all communication out to other agencies, to other groups, to the NGOs, to the private, whatever it is, healthcare, clinics, it's always done through this liaison's office, right? It's not done anywhere else in that incident command structure. So this is important, right? They're the ones who really ensure that those connections are made. And again, flow of information comes that way through them as we're working. Next. So we'll go to the general staff. Next. The first group in the general staff is operations. Next slide. So they're the ones that really develop and implement tactics and strategies to accomplish. It's the biggest piece of what we do. It is the responders of public health. All things that we need to do, it's done under this operations branch. Right? So there's an operations section chief, and we'll talk, and then they're broken out by either sector or, activity, depending on what makes the most sense as they're breaking it out under. But these are the doers. So they usually are broken out by these core functions of public health, but they're the ones that figure out how to do the immunization, how to do emergency transport, whatever it is that we need to do. So operations is the biggest branch in incident command, and most of you will probably somehow slip into there. What's important about this is it's not going to be your normal job, right? Most probably. So what we do in disasters is we respond to the disaster. We don't continue our normal operating procedures. And let's halt that for a second. So these functions will probably be separate than what you do daily. So you will be slotted into one of these sort of boxes in understanding what do I do, what are emergency functions that need to happen for the public health department. Again, so kind of thinking about that is super important. Next slide. Okay, planning. So planning are really our thinkers, right? Next slide. They're the ones that prepare all of the documentation, they manage information, they do the situational awareness, they track sort of how the resources are assigned internally, they keep documentation, they create the exit strategy. Ding, 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 ding. You're supposed to start a disaster with an exit strategy. Kind of funny, right? Almost 2 years after COVID, we've started. But the reality is you need to know when you stop disaster activities, right? That response or even recovery could be under disaster. When do you stop it and move into normal operations? So as many of you know, right, look at how many systems were impacted and kind of put on hold when we had all the state redirects coming into public health, right? So they better have had a plan that if there is a disaster, which I'm sure most of them didn't, but if there is a disaster and we should lose 30% of our workforce, what do we do, right? What are the key things that must continue for us, whether it's the library system, parks and recs, wherever we're, correctional facilities, because we're losing this to whatever this operation is, right? Then public health also has to have a plan of, oh my gosh, we now got 10,000 new people. how do I actually put them into the boxes that I need to put them into, ensuring that they understand the emergency functions of what needs to be done, right? So you can think about, again, how much lack of disaster planning there probably was in these other sectors, because not imagining what a pandemic actually would entail in pulling people out and stopping their activities. Okay, next slide. So logistics is pretty much what it sounds like. Next slide. They're the ones who really do, making sure that we get what we need, right? The ordering, obtaining, maintaining, accounting, where is it? So a lot of times we have, not a lot of times, we have something called SNS, and you'll hear that. It's a strategic national stockpile, right? And so there's stockpiles of stuff for disasters. Obviously, the stockpiles didn't account for this pandemic, but for example, there could be a whole bunch of things for earthquakes, which are like search and rescue stuff, generators, let's say, even masks. And by the way, if you guys remember early on, we didn't have enough masks. There was this whole discussion of going into the stockpiles and taking out masks to be able to provide to the hospitals, et cetera, right? And so there is sort of that system that's continuously being kept up, and logistics has access to that. They do food. So if you're in the DOC for 12 hours, somebody needs to order food, right? Logistics thinks about that. You need vests to go out. Somebody needs to think about that, et cetera. Transportation, moving your team around from the different things. And all of that falls under logistics. Next. Next, finance. Exactly what it sounds like, right? The people you really need to be your best friend is finance. By the way, I went into public health because I'm not good at finance at all. So I'm always like, just I trust you, but help me get what I need to get, right? And what we need to do in sort of moving things forward. But important to realize that, again, one of the biggest things they need to do is ensure that we're responding appropriately so that we can get state and federal reimbursement through mutual aid, right? And so if you think about, again, how much tracking has to be done, right? So all of these people, let's just talk for a second, just public health employees. Let's not even talk about all the state redirects and all of that. But public health, when you have a disaster, you start working overtime. You're not going home. Like, it doesn't work like that, by the way. And we're going to talk about that when we talk about your own preparedness. You can't come 6 hours later and say, by the way, like, I need to go pick up my child from school. You're a disaster service worker. You're on for 12 hours. Like, you need to have figured that out, right? But you're usually paid for 8 hours. So how do they track that overtime? And eventually they need to be reimbursed for that because the county doesn't have that in their budget ahead of time, right? So thinking about even all the way down to those details and what that looks like, finance needs to take care of that. Also things like compensation for, injury or damage to property. And like, so all of those things really falls under finance and admin. And again, the state mandates that we use, as I said, SEMS and NIMS, so that we can get reimbursed. Next slide. Okay, so all that, I kind of gave you examples, but every agency does that. So what does it look like in public health usually? So let's go to the next slide. It may seem overwhelming, but actually it's not. It's actually really well. So we know we have the incident commander, right? On top, PIO, safety officer, liaison officer, right? So our command staff, operations, planning, logistics, finance, and look at operations. Ops is huge, right? And what is ops broken into? And we're going to talk about this. This is really important. So let's go to the next slide. Ops is broken into 3 different branches. Every local health jurisdiction, by the way, doesn't have this ICS. Everyone has to create their own ICS based on what functions they do as a health department. Like, some health departments have veterinary services, some have mental health, some don't, right? And so you create the structure based on the services that you actually provide. But you have to think about operations kind of in 3 buckets. The first being emergency public health operations. And this is what I was saying to you. When a disaster happens, you switch your mindset and you think, what are the things that I need to do as a public health department to respond to the disaster? Not what are the normal things I do. What do I need to do to respond to the disaster? And you built out that branch. Then the middle branch is continuity of public health operations. We call that COOP, C-O-O-P, COOP planning, continuity of operations planning. And the reality there is, okay, I'm going to be switching all these people into doing this work. what are the things in the public health department that cannot stop? Because if it stops, it may create additional morbidity and mortality, right? So for example, we cannot stop analyzing water quality or air quality or surveillance of other diseases, right? We can't stop that. Vital records can't stop, right? So there's certain things that you have to identify within your public health department that no matter what I do, I gotta keep these running. And usually when we do COOPs, so it's funny because we created an instrument early on, or we meaning the Center for Public Health and Disasters, an instrument early on for public health departments. And people used to always say, well, what are your essential services, right? And so as we were doing this, I started realizing like, that word is not a good word because it makes it seem like nobody else is essential, right? In the public health workforce. Like, what do you mean? Only these 3 activities that we do are essential, and other people hearing who don't understand public health at all in general will be like, oh, public health thinks these 4 activities are essential. The rest are just, in addition to. So I was like, let's shift this word and let's try and call it uninterruptible routine functions. So we created this term EARF, right? Which is uninterruptible routine functions, which is these are our routine things that public health does that cannot be interrupted so that we have to keep it going. And so kind of taking that feeling out of it, where people also were feeling like, are you saying I'm not essential to public health? But all of the response is essential, right? So we really look at COOPs as what are those uninterruptible routine functions of the public health department that no matter what disaster we're under, cannot stop, right? Otherwise it will create its own issue of additional morbidity and mortality as we move forward. And then the third thing, again, depending exactly like sort of how it falls in your local health jurisdiction, is medical operations. So really thinking about what that looks like, usually EMS and our hospital system, again, depending on how that fits into your structure. I have a brother who's younger than me, who is also Dr. Dorian, but I always tell this story because I'm the original Dr. Dorian. So I remind him of that all the time, but he's an ER doc by training. And I always tell him, medicine is super important, but just so you know, you're only one tool in the public health toolbox, right? And I think it's important to always keep that in mind in public health, that clinical support, clinical services, all of that, even though you think that's all that people talk about, that's only one thing that we do, right? And I always say, I have to stop them from getting to you. That's the real public health, right? Activity. So important to keep this in mind, because a lot of times in even your risk communication and programming, people will be like, well, what are the doctors doing? What's treatment? What's therapy? Like all those things which are important, but that's one piece in what we need to do to ensure healthy communities, right? And so that's important to keep in mind. Okay, next slide. So when we talk about emergency public health operations, remember that first sort of branch, we're really looking at, right, community health, epi surveillance, laboratories, environmental health, mental health. But remember, this is not what they normally do. So they need to decide, right, early on, what does veterinary health do for this disaster? So let's just say it's an earthquake, right? There's a lot that veterinary health does because they evacuate horses or whatever it is. And there's a lot of work that gets done actually. Or let's say it's, a disaster that has a vector. It's a vector-borne disease, and we start thinking about it. So this is not veterinary health comes together and they are under operations. No, this is the disaster functions of veterinary health comes together, the emergency functions of what they need to do, okay? The other thing just to note, and so that you know as you're working, shelter operations, funny enough, falls under public health. And a lot of public health agencies don't really realize that because usually American Red Cross does shelters, right? But the idea is that public health has that understanding that American Red Cross, yes, they'll set up the shelters and run the shelters, but then you'll see public health nurses are actually seconded to those shelters where they'll do, surveillance and all of those things. So we actually are responsible for shelter operations. We're also responsible for shelter operations for any medically fragile community. So American Red Cross shelters won't take medically fragile people into their shelters. So even people on oxygen, which is not a big deal, right? But again, so we are responsible in thinking about that and what that looks like in shelter operations. Next slide. We have our COOP, right? What needs to continue? So you see, it's the same boxes, but it's maybe these boxes shouldn't be there, right? But the concept is what in these boxes cannot stop. And when we do, by the way, this planning, the uninterruptible routine functions, usually we forecast out. So we'll do like what cannot stop for 72 hours, right? So for example, let's just say our TB program has meals delivered, right? So can we stop that for 72 hours and shift people to doing emergency response because that first 72 hours is super important? Or we can, let's just leave it as a skeleton of, 2 people, and we should already know who are our highly vulnerable populations within that TB food program, et cetera, right? But after 72 hours, you may come back and say, there's no way I can stop that program. So that staff cannot be part of emergency response. They must come back to this, right? So it's sort of those 2 arms have to work at the same time. Public health doesn't stop for all of those other things just because we have a disaster and we're responding. Next slide. And then there's the medical operations, right? Really looking at sort of EMS, clinics, hospitals. It may not even fall under you, right? It depends on how the county is organized to know what falls under public health's purview, right? Like who's the director and how does that fall under it? Okay, next slide. Planning, obviously, exactly what we talked about. They collect, they interpret all the data during the disaster as it's happening. They do the rapid assessments, they do the modeling, they do that forecasting out, right? Looks like we're gonna be in this for 3 months. So operations, make sure your plans are ready for 3 months as you're moving forward. And we'll talk about in that next section, they ask us, by the way, to do individual preparedness planning for 72 hours. That's originally what you're supposed to have. You're supposed to be prepared to be on your own. Yo-yo, by the way, that's a term. You're on your own, baby, for 72 hours, right? But now we realize that's not also very good because there's sort of these catastrophic situations. And if somebody couldn't have left the house for 72 hours early on, would they be able to sort of sustain as we were moving through, whether it's COVID or even a larger earthquake when infrastructure will go down, right? There won't be water, there won't be electricity, etc. All right, next slide is logistics. Again, really looking at some of the pieces that we usually stand up when we look at the logistics sections that provide resources, again, for operations and planning. Depending on what we put in operations, depending on what they tell us in planning, we will line these up. Remember, this is for the response. So if you don't need to have a pharmaceutical response, you don't have to have the public health pharmacy, group sort of be stood up. That's again what? That flexibility of ICS. Next slide. Finance and admin, right? Really looking at procurement, considering all the fiscal impacts of this disaster. Remember, public health departments started off with less resources. Then that disaster hit. Remember my slide. Now they need to have more resources when they're actually being hit. So how do we think about procuring what we need to do? And 1, we declare that emergency. We start with mutual aid. We ensure SEMS and NIMS. And then we see sort of how the state and or federal can actually help us in creating all of these things. So I just want to remind us before I go to the next thing, which is really this idea of, you're beginning your journey to, I just got emotional. You're going to make a big difference, right? We need people to make a big difference. And what that means is really this idea of doing the greatest good for the greatest number. Sometimes that's hard, right? Because, again, coming back to medicine, they take a Hippocratic oath to do everything they can for the one person in front of them. But in public health, it's really thinking kind of bigger, right? That doesn't mean you lose sight of the individual. That doesn't mean, they always say statistics are people with their tears wiped off, right? And so really thinking about that is important to keep that in mind. But in disasters, it's again really important to think about how am I going to help everybody come back to quote unquote normal, better than normal. But really that's the concept, right? How do I empower people to take care of themselves? Not me taking care of them, because that's humanitarian aid. We don't like that, right? How do we empower people to take care of themselves? So really thinking about building on existing capacities within the community before disasters. Right, so all of this fits in thinking about that. And then again, considering every action that you take during a disaster to truly be foundational as development programming. So try to make sure that it's not just about outputs, but it's about outcomes. It's not just about handing supplies. It's about creating or recreating systems, right? And sort of thinking about that is important.